Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thanks for finding me here in the crowded world of YouTube orchid care videos. Here I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids, mostly outdoors, a few indoors without any help from grow lights or humidifiers or a greenhouse, much as I love one. Really just me and them struggling along, making do, and perhaps some of those insights might help you in your orchid journey, but these are the ramblings of an amateur, which this video, plant lovers, will perhaps demonstrate. So if you think that is of any use to you, do hit subscribe and the notification bell, because I post every week on a Friday, amateur ramblings, but they might be of some use to you. Who knows? Because yes, here we have a species, Phalaenopsis. And I am so thrilled that I finally got this to bloom. Now, I bought it in bloom, and then the subsequent year it produced a flower spike which died. And then this year, which is the third year, we saw ourselves through to fruition, and look at those flowers. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Phalaenopsis Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love, as Bananarama once pointed out. So Q does recognize Aphrodite as a species, and it is, well, according to Q, it's found primarily in the Philippines, but in other sources it also says Taiwan and the Philippines, so who knows, not quite sure. Does it really matter for our purposes? Perhaps not. Except to say that it is a low elevation orchid, so this is definitely a warm, humid grower that you could not grow outside in my conditions. So this is one of the rare things since our move that I am now committing to growing inside all year. And look at it, isn't it the most beautiful flower? So open. All right, so let's start at the very beginning, because you know I love a little etymology. So Phalaenopsis, from two Greek words, phaleana meaning moth, and opsis, appearance, like, hence the name moth orchid. Now, I don't know, I must have known this before, I've just forgotten it, but now I know where the common name moth orchid comes from. I'm sure I did know that, I've just forgotten. Now, everyone is very familiar with Phalaenopsis. I mean, you can literally get them everywhere. The hybrids that you find in supermarkets, in nurseries, in garden centers, florists, literally everywhere, you'll see Phalaenopsis in bloom at any point of the year. So they're hybrids that have been obviously derived from combining many of the different species, and this is one of the species that they are taken from. And I must say that the humble white Phalaenopsis is a bit of a gateway orchid. It's often the first thing anyone grows because you're often given them, or you find them in a terrible condition and feel you have to rescue them. I went through that phase, plant lovers, and perhaps it is an early to intermediate stage of orchid growing that you feel obliged to rescue Phalaenopsis from supermarkets. Well, I have moved on from that. I still have a couple of sort of hybrid supermarket Phalaenopsis. One has the most beautiful color and the other has the most beautiful form. So although it's white, it's got the form of more of a species type. So it's in bud at the moment. I'm very happy about that. All the others, I have to say, in the move, given that space is limited, I ditched. Because really, you can always find a Phalaenopsis in a supermarket to fall in love with. So, brings us back to species. Now, if you've got the conditions, i.e. you've got somewhere warmer and inside and more humid, if you're in a colder climate like me, then the species are certainly interesting to branch out to once you may have mastered their hybrid, more common or garden cousins. And I must say, Aphrodite has proven to be relatively easy. So firstly, it's growing from basically sea level to lowish elevation. So it certainly is a warm, humid grower in its native habitat, which means you need to have it in the warmest part of the house and the most humid part of the house all year. So for me, that's always upstairs. We're in a two-story house where it's getting the most ambient warmth and humidity. Now, the flower spike, so it's early, well, no, it's mid-spring here, and the flowers have just finished opening, so it's certainly a late spring, early summer bloomer, which means the flower is triggered in winter, the spike then matures, takes quite a long time to mature from late winter into spring, and then we open late spring, much like its hybrid cousins. So one spike a year, triggered by the change of season and slight temperature change. But this time last year in our other house, the spike emerged and then it just withered and died. And I feel it was because I wasn't keeping the plant hydrated enough. So there's hydration and then there's sort of ambient humidity. Now, the humidity in Melbourne is not bad actually. We're not a hot, dry sort of Mediterranean climate. We're a moist Mediterranean climate, perhaps. So inside, the ambient humidity is relatively lovely. It's not too dry. But I think I quite simply didn't water it enough. So what I've done now, so you can see it's potted in one of these pots that you buy with these slits. These just come from a hardware store in Australia, a chain store called Bunnings, which you'll all be familiar with in this country. But a pot with aeration is really important because these are epiphytes, but we'll get to that. So I think last year, not hydrated enough. Literally, I didn't water enough, wasn't humid enough. This year, I've made a particular effort. Now, the leaves had really dehydrated. They'd really shriveled and were not looking well. Hence, I'm quite sure the flower died. So I've really tried to focus on watering it, keeping it moist-ish most of the time. And what I did, I've got it sitting in a pot, a decorative pot, and I put in the bottom of that a curved dish. So it sits on the curved dish. And then the water, when I water the plant, runs through and sits almost like a reservoir. So the roots of the plant aren't going into it, but it is really moist and humid around the root area of the plant. And that was kind of by accident, I think, but by design, it's certainly, I think, kind of promoted the perfect conditions for this orchid to thrive and bloom. So there you go. Humidity and moisture, I think, really important for these species types. Now, if you need to know where your orchid comes from, if it's a species, easiest thing is to go to orchidspecies.com, and I'll put that along here for you. That will tell you where the plant comes from and the elevation, which is really important, and also the light tendency. So most Phalaenopsis do want light on the lower end of the spectrum. However, of course, they're not deep shade plants, so if you don't give them enough light, they won't bloom. So where this is, it's at the back of a room, but it does get kind of filtered morning light, so it's kind of eastward looking. But it's far enough back in the room that it's quite filtered, not too strong, but it is brightish indirect light. So there you go. Make of that what you will, but if you give them too much light, the leaves will certainly burn. But I would say if you're growing a hybrid Phalaenopsis well and getting it to flower every year, then you'll certainly be able to grow most of their species cousins. Now, next up, as you can see, the flower is sort of lolling, as is the plant. So these are classic epiphytes. Now, I often say this, there are epiphytes and epiphytes and epiphytes. So Phalaenopsis are the sort of epiphyte that literally clings to the side of a tree and its roots run up and down the bark. And so the leaves tend to be more pendulous and the flowers more pendulous. That also allows water to run off and not to sit in the crown because they're in, a moistish, tropical-ish environment. So plenty of airborne moisture and rain, which you don't want sitting in the crown of the plant. So it is designed to drip off and then the plant to hang down. And obviously white flowers tend to be pollinated by moths at night, so it'd be very visible at night. So bear that in mind. If you're in a warmer climate, you could grow it on a wooden mount or bark or tree fern log, whatever, and hang it up so the plant is growing more perpendicularly and the flowers and the leaves will hang down, which it will love. And even if it were to grow on the branch of a tree that was more horizontal, the plant will still want to hang its leaves and flowers. So bear that in mind. Now, in pot culture, it does really well. I have got mine in just a large bark, so nothing else in there. You could put sphagnum moss to retain the moisture. You just want to make sure that doesn't, I know this sounds oxymoronic, stay too moist, because it can get quite moist and stale and dank. So if you're using sphagnum, just kind of make sure that the whole medium is free draining and it dries-ish before you keep watering it. So mine is just in a large bark, which the plant loves, but that does mean you've got to keep it hydrated because the large bark, obviously the water passes through quite quickly. And although the bark absorbs more, there's more air pockets, and so it is going to dry out faster. So catch 22. And mine's in terracotta, which does retain moisture better. And if it's not in a direct sunny spot, the pot won't dry out so quickly. But if you've got terracotta in a bright, warm place, it does dry out really quickly in summer. So plastic can be good for that. I just always like terracotta because I find it more attractive. Now, of course, the other thing you can do to keep up the hydration is just to mist these. If you've got a mister and if you're wandering around with a cup of tea in the morning, just give it a mist. So talking of Aphrodite, of course, very associated with Cyprus, which is an island that I lived on when I was quite young, for 2 years. An amazing place. It's really seared into my imagination and memory as a kid. The amazing ruins, the mountains, the beaches. It's an incredible island. And I just coincidentally read this book, which is called Venus and Aphrodite, History of a Goddess by Bettany Hughes. And it literally is the history of Aphrodite and Venus, which are the same person, of course. The names morphed from the Greek to the Roman, but also it just narrates the history of the goddess from much further east across into the Mediterranean, and then how she's still kind of with us today. I mean, hence the song by Bananarama. So feeding wise, Phalaenopsis, I would just feed it exactly the same as your hybrid phal. So topical application of a slow release fertilizer in spring, and then liquid fertilizer throughout the warmer seasons. So for me, obviously spring, summer into autumn, depending how warm it gets, and dilute those liquid feeds down sort of 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose. So I always really pull it back. And you can alternate that with something that's not a food or a fertilizer, so something that's more like a tonic, which can be seaweed based, often fantastic for any indoor plants, particularly if something's just been repotted or it's recovering. And this plant, I must say, did recover well from my poor care because the leaves really fleshed out and it's grown on a treat and flowered. So let's just take a moment to look at the flowers. So, we're all familiar with our regular hybrid phal, the white phal, but just look at the demarcation between the petals and the sepals and how open they are. I really adore the shape of this flower. Now, there is another species called amabilis, which often was called a synonym of this or considered to be the same, but Q now separates the two, and amabilis is actually found in Australia as well, in the far north, because tropical up there. Apparently there's a slightly different shape and a difference in the lip. But I adore the shape of this. I really adore the shape of this. And I think for me, it's a much more satisfying shape than the hybrid phals, which are much rounder in their look. Now this one just has, I've just noticed another little bud forming just there, as you can see. Now, as this has not successfully bloomed for me, I don't know what's going to happen with this flower spike. So with your hybrid phals, and I've made a video about this, sometimes the stem dies and you can see it immediately, it goes brown and withers off and you snip it off. But sometimes the flowers die and drop off, but the stem remains green. And if you leave it, it will resprout and produce another sort of raceme almost from the end, and it will flower, sometimes multiply. So you can leave it and you just almost get sequential blooms from those hybrid phals if the stem decides not to die for you. If it does die and you cut it off, then it will take another year for the plant to flower again. The ones that you find in supermarkets and hardware stores and florists are all forced, so they are forced to flower throughout the year. But once you get it back into sort of normal cultivation, it will flower once for you. However, you can then get sequential bloomings from that spike if it survives. So I'm curious to see what might happen with this one. I will keep you posted if it decides to keep on flowering once the actual flowers have dropped off. Now, absolutely no fragrance, so I'd imagine the large whiteness of this flower is attractive to moths in the Philippines where it grows. So I imagine that is what pollinates it. But I've got, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 flowers with a 5th bud appearing. Very, very satisfying. I am thrilled that I finally looked after you, Aphrodite, and she has decided to flower. So there we are, plant lovers. I would say if you can grow a hybrid Phalaenopsis, why not have a look at trying some of the species? The flowers are often a bit more elegant, I think, and a bit more restrained than their quite boofy, blousy hybrid friends, which have been hybridized for a reason. But I just find this super elegant. So there we are, plant lovers, from the goddess of beauty and love and myself, there we go, a very successful blooming. Now, I hope all is well in your world. If you're curious to know what might be going on next week, I post every week on a Friday, so hit subscribe to find out what's going on. I hope all's well. I hope your orchids are blooming and doing their thing wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you next week.